Okay, you good?
That's trippy. No.
All right.
Let's go.
Next week we have an election for my position because I'm done. So
Maybe another week, depending on how many applicants.
that would be really sad. Please apply. So how to be a competition architect by two idiots who don't hate themselves enough. So we did this job. All right. Let us advance the slide, maybe. Okay.
All right, so we're going to get started by talking about the black team and what the black team does. For a competition, a lot of you are aware that a bunch of different colors are assigned to different groups of people that either work on or participate in the competition. For our competitions, the black team stands for the infrastructure team. So the black team is responsible for setting up the competition and making sure that the infrastructure as code works to actually deploy it. So one of the important things about being a CI is just recognizing that you can't do everything. You need to make sure that you realize that you're not going to be the one that puts on every single part of this competition, and you can't be doing dev work all the time. You have to save your time for the management stuff, and generally, you just need to give the work that you need to do from a technical standpoint out to your black team and trust your black team.
That's what the black team's for.
Yep.
So that you, as the competition architect, don't have to do everything.
So, the members of the black team that you need for every competition are Windows lead, Linux lead, and Nginx lead. The Windows lead is responsible for Windows images and the Windows Ansible. And we'll get into exactly what Ansible does in a minute and how we generate images. Similarly, the Linux lead is responsible for procuring or generating Linux images and writing Linux Ansible. Finally, the Nginx lead creates business tasks for the competitors to do during the competition and grades them on those challenges. In addition, they will also recruit white teamers to help with that endeavor.
These people, the person you recruit as your Nginx lead should be very knowledgeable about, one, how competitions work, how they run, what sort of things are happening, what sort of, they also need to understand your sort of like environment. We'll get into that a little bit more later. But this should be somebody who really has their knowledge together and like understands the bit of the business world and professionalism, how to report on events, etc.
Networking lead is a thing that needs to sometimes exist. If you have a competition where you have a bunch of really funky networking stuff and not just like a very simple router or a very simple router built into the virtualization environment, you're going to want a networking lead to take that off your hands.
I had one because I didn't want to spend my whole life building a Palo Alto image out and running Ansible against it. So I had a networking lead, shout out Ali, he did a great job, to help me with the Palo Altos, get their images up, get their passwords changed, their licenses set in the Ansible, all of that. Worked great. Josh, you didn't have a networking lead, right?
I did not.
Yeah.
And the reason I did not have a networking lead was because we basically used Openstack's built-in networking for our last competition. So we didn't actually have a router that we needed to set up in a automated fashion.
So not always needed, but it can. If you are doing some funky networking stuff, have somebody dedicated to that job.
You're also going to want to find a logging lead depending on the competition. This was very important for IRSEC, and it's going to be very important for ISTS as well. The logging lead is responsible for giving the team something to work with. If they're trying to find red team, having a centralized place to look at their logs is really, really helpful. So we like to give our competitors that kind of like that as a way to find red team. The logging lead is responsible for deploying logging to hosts and for providing the central logging server for visibility.
Yeah. So I was originally thinking like suggesting central logging server. However, after this competition, ISTS this last weekend, I realized like from a like auditing perspective, if you can have some sort of visibility from the like black team side into what's happening in the environment, you have a better capability to understand and maybe see somebody's doing something they're not supposed to, maybe they're violating scope or they're doing something they're not supposed to do. You want to be able to have that insight. it's good to have. So the more of that you have, the better. That's why I didn't just say maybe on that one.
And you're also going to want to have a scoring lead. The scoring lead might be actually a additional task onto another black teamer because it really isn't that hard. We're at the point now where the scoring engines that we have are pretty good, and you might want to consider having a scoring lead if, like a dedicated scoring lead, if you have some really, really weird checks, or all of your checks are WinRM for some reason. And if that is the case, I am sorry, WinRM is very picky with any scoring check.
Don't do that to yourself.
Yes.
Less WinRM checks.
Yeah. No, be gone all WinRM checks.
Thank you.
Weird OS lead. This is an ISDS only thing. I say that because you should not be supplying anything this weird to an IRSec competition, because if you do, that's pretty mean. Shout out to Robert, who did a great job handling the stuff I threw him. I didn't throw React at him last year. This is why I made the position, though, for this year. React OS last year was a huge pain, and we had one person tackle it, and they kind of like fumbled with it and were really frustrated the whole time. We got it up, and then it was very stubborn anyway. So I decided this year I had some weird things that were a little non-standard. I had a completely assembly-based operating system, which didn't see much use because there wasn't so much remote access available to it. Shocker. And I also had two non-standard distributions of Linux that I was planning to apply. One of them, my Weird OS lead Robert told me, isn't going to work. So I was like, all right, great job. Thank you for telling me that months in advance of the competition. And the other one we got working. So we had a good time with this. If you're throwing, this is definitely only an ISTS thing. If you're throwing something funky onto it, that's going to be a huge pain for either your Windows or your Linux lead to make an image for. Have somebody dedicated to this position so that you can save some bandwidth for your Windows and Linux lead. King of the Hill lead, also ISTS only. People don't apparently like to do King of the Hill for some reason, and it wins the competition every year apparently. So, when you're picking your King of the Hill lead, go for somebody who understands how to insert vulnerabilities into an environment. That's basically the major task, and also somebody who knows how to do that in a fun way. And I guess what we're looking for now is trying to get some people some new ideas in here. Philip and I did it 2 years ago. Philip did it this year. We both tried some ideas. People didn't seem to participate as much as we'd have liked. So keep the fresh ideas coming. I think both of the things we did were pretty fun. It's just, when you're recruiting your King of the Hill lead, pick somebody who's creative, because they need to yeet a bunch of vulns into an environment in such a way as to make it fun, not completely broken, and also challenging. So creativity is important, especially if we want to make new ideas to get more people involved in COF. Maybe they'll start playing now that like the last two competitions, people won because they did COF. I don't know. More COF.
I wanted to do COF, but I was locked out the whole time from my COF box.
Sad.
I would advise you not to do that.
Don't lock yourself out of your COF boxes
No,
if you're
Red
giving
Team
them.
locked us out.
For the
Change
stream,
your credits.
we got a comment here that said, hey, look, I would have done that if we actually had access to our cough box, which is quite unfortunate.
Change your creds, Chief.
Yeah, that one.
I did.
All right, CTF lead. Again, ISTS only, because the actual CTF lead is this man. But that's not a sub thing that you make your black teamers do. That's a job. Maybe he'll give another talk on that some other time. But this is an ISTS only thing. CTF for ISTS, not a huge deal. You don't have to go around and recruit like people for some super crazy, well done challenges. Really, it's just there to have something else for blue teamers to do in case they're like totally bodied and can't do anything and want to compete. It's also something to waste their time and distract them while they should be blue teaming. So like, not a huge deal, but very important in overall because it needs to be a part of the game. ISTS is a crazy competition that tests you on so many things. So Emily did a great job this year. I haven't shouted out all of my people, so I'm going to go back and shout out Connor for my Windows lead and Jacob Rude for my Linux lead, and I did get my networking lead. So CTF lead, Emily did a great job this year. She got in on this like a month ago. It's not like, that should give you an idea of like, this isn't something crazy. CTF challenges, you can reuse some from the past years. It's not a huge deal as much as it would be for like the RIT-Sec CTF in general, but it's an important role, so. And the game lead, again, ISTS only, wow. Good job, Fred and Brad, who hopped on later. We had a great game this year. So traditionally, in the past, the game was just kind of there for fun. I decided to score it because I feel like the game is a good way to incorporate the rest of the competition into a scored metric. We did something ambitious this year with the game, and we decided, let's incorporate King of the Hill and the CTF and purple teaming and interacting with sponsors and an actual game into the game. And then we'll score it so that people are encouraged to do everything. This kind of worked. People really did the CTF, and people didn't quite do the purple teaming as much. That was probably my fault for not injecting enough vulnerabilities into the environment. That's another thing ISTS needs to keep in mind. But the game is definitely a wild card in the competition because it can be whatever. It's been different every year. 3 years ago, it was like some spaceship flying, build up your armada, have a battle at the end game. That was 4 years ago, wasn't it? Wow. 3 years ago was an election where you had votes that you were trying to buy and cast so that your candidate would win the election. 2 years ago, Jax was a C2 like botnet network that you were supposed to build up. That was interesting. And this year we had a game where we built out teams having armies, and then you would attack territories and yada yada. So it's completely different every year. So this is very tied into your theme. Obviously, all those are completely different, but related to the theme of the competition, which we'll get into in a bit. Your game is just something to add a little bit of fun. I recommend incorporating other parts of the competition into it if you can. And for your game lead, you're going to want somebody generally who's pretty good at web dev, because we have a pretty solid web backend now. Good job, lads. And they need to be able to create an application that the teams can interact with in the environment. So this is really a developer position. Every year it's involved writing some amount of code, usually a web app, and it has to communicate with the competition environment. So those are my thoughts of game lead. Theming, wow, look at that, go ahead.
All right, so
Actually, no, I said I was going to do this, didn't I? All right, theming. Remember, I said we were going to talk about that shortly, so we are now. Your teams. Let's go over the teams, because you need to theme all of these teams. So, you have red team, who is your antagonist. For me this year, the red team were the ninjas, because the blue team were the samurais. And so we had some sort of antagonist for the protagonist. Josh, what was the red team for you? The ghosts?
the ghosts were the red team for my competition. Yep.
Yep. So you wanna think of antagonists when you're thinking of the red team. We've sort of had like in the theme in the ISTS at least for the last two, we've had like a role reversal where the blue team is actually the bad guys in the scenario, but like that's up to you. Just remember that they should probably be opposing sides. Black team is generally like the upper management of whatever scenario organization you have. These are the people that like everyone answers to, and the white team are the superiors to the blue team in that organization as well. You can incorporate sponsors into this. We usually keep them separate so that they can interact however they want, but that's up to you as a competition architect. Make sure to tie it into whatever theme you have. So tell your story. So the scenario, this is where telling your story comes in. Who's the boss? Who is the person who's employing this blue team? Why are they there? What sort of work are they doing? What kind of business is being run? What sort of story are you trying to tell with the organization? This is going to affect the rest of your theming. So this is where your creativity comes out. You're telling a story. And so maybe last year you are trying to build up an APT. You're red teams. This year you were ninjas working for a big corporate entity. In 2 years, whichever year Sean did, I don't even know what years are anymore. You were a political campaign. So like, what is the scenario? You want to pick something that blue teamers can get into and have fun with, immerse themselves into the environment. It's telling a story.
All right. So, part of the scenario is picking out host names and names for specific items of the competition. And one of those is host names. You need to actually be able to give computers a name that each competitor can refer to. Generally, these are going to be people, they're going to be places, or they're going to be things. And another question is, how much do you want everyone involved to suffer? That's right on the screen, and for good reason. If I named my potential computer name to supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, that would be really, really annoying to type, for example.
Nobody's using that DNS record.
Nobody's using that as a DNS record, exactly. So if you want a simpler competition, I'd recommend simpler names as well that are easy to remember and easier to not mistype if you're trying to SSH into 15 boxes every other minute. So keep that in mind.
For reference, this was me adding myself. My host names were really obnoxious to say. I thought they were really great because they were all very on theme. The theme was like cyberpunk feudal Japan, so we went with Japanese mythology. Those names are not the most easy to pronounce, and I'm sorry in particular to my logging lead Allison, who had to listen to us mispronounce all of them all the time. Thank you for putting up with us. But again, this is how much do you want everyone involved to suffer. It might actually immerse them into the theme more if they have to get into it and really try hard to pronounce it, but it also just might make them grumpy. So that's the thing you have to weigh. How much do you want to have fun with it? How much do you want everyone involved to be like, why did you pick these names?
All right. Next thing that you actually have to name, users. Generally, people are things. Locations doesn't really work quite as well for this, but the important questions that you need to keep in mind is how many users do you want? And also, again, how much do you want them to suffer? We have the same problem with host names with users that we had with host names, in which the more complicated the name is, the harder it is to type out, the more annoyed that a potential blue team could be. The other variable there is the number of users, and more users is harder to manage because you have to manage password changes for all these users, and you have to make sure that none of these users are compromised by red team. And in addition, a smaller number of users makes it way easier to just look at a list of users on the system and say, oh, that doesn't seem right. So fine-tuning those variables is going to depend heavily on the competition and what you're trying to do.
On the lower end, I've seen competitions with like 7 users for each, like 7 users for a Windows environment with like 2 domain admins or whatever, and 7 users for a Linux environment with 2 admin accounts. But I've also seen like last year at CCDC we had like 60 user accounts with different usernames, and I had a bunch of user accounts. So again, how much do you want everyone to suffer? If you're going for a more beginner competition level, probably less users, probably not long names, probably not names that are phonetic write-downs of a different language. That's kind of hard to type in and keep track of.
If you do have like a list of users at 60 or even, something ridiculous, essentially you're making it so that the teams have to script things, which depending on what you're trying to do may be a very good thing. But if you have a beginner competition with people who are newer to competitions, you probably don't want that, and that will be the case for IRSEC and to some extent ISTS as well. All right, so injects. What are injects? And essentially, they're a business task. You give these out to users, to blue teamers, and you say, here, management needs this. Go do it. And they're responsible for doing that. And they are scored based on their performance. The idea is to encourage blue teamers to participate in the entirety of the competition, not just scoring. Because you can keep up scoring all day long, but adding injects to it is a really, really good way to test the understanding of security and just give a better experience overall.
I would say if you want to find a good balance between a good person to talk to about this is the person who did both of our inject leads, and actually both people, Brendan McGlynn and Wyatt Tauber, both of them did a phenomenal job with injects for our 2 competitions. It's a very nice balance between too many and too difficult and testing knowledge with injects. So if you are looking for somebody to talk to about injects lead, or you are an injects lead that needs somebody to talk to those guys. They're great.
So you do have the balancing act of you want to make sure that the injects aren't too hard, and you want to make sure that there's not too excessively many injects. If you give them too many, they're not going to spend time on it because they feel scoring is more important. If you give them injects that are too hard, they're going to do the same thing. If you give them injects that are too easy, they'll spend not enough time on the injects and just spend more time on scoring or King of the Hill or something else, although nobody spends time on King of the Hill apparently. So it's really important to take all of that into consideration when you're talking with your injects lead about exactly how you want the competition to be run. One other quick note on injects before we move on. One thing that we've implemented in the past few years is giving everyone feedback. So give all the blue teamers feedback on their injects so they know exactly where they went wrong. And having that feedback is really helpful because it actually kind of encourages the teams to do injects. For example, if I realize that professionalism is 30% of my grade, and I'm looking at this inject and saying, oh wow, if I submit anything, I'm at least getting 30% of the points. That is a strong incentive to actually submit something, even if it's a, I am sorry, management or black team, I cannot actually do this because reason here. And if you're professional about it, you might get points. That kind of thing isn't really visible without having some kind of feedback sent to each individual team.
I also should note, I didn't make a slide here, I should have, on scoring breakdowns, balancing, but usually you want injects and uptime to be weighted pretty similarly. I think we kind of talked about scoring later, so we'll cover that more then.
All right, for each competition, you want to have a baller logo. And we have here 2 baller logos. So our logos this year were made by a RIT alum, Sean Sun, and he works over at Miss Greens, one of our sponsors. But essentially, you want to give your logo guy time to actually design something awesome like this. So let him know about the theme a few months in advance. And if you give him enough time, this is the kind of stuff that you can see. These are both really cool logos. And Sean Sun knocked it out of the park.
Absolutely.
Anything else to say on that?
Yeah, highlight or reiterate ditto on earlier better, make them aware of the theme. The artistic process isn't like done, so the sooner they know, the sooner they can get the juices flowing and you get stuff like this, which just it makes me happy every time I see it. All right, topology. What a fun time topology is. The networking environment, the whole kit and caboodle. This is what people spend most of their time on, so you got to do it right.
All right, so first thing you're going to want to do as a CA is you're directly responsible for determining what goes on that network. So there's a lot of questions you need to ask here. Do we have any cloud boxes? Usually the answer to that is yes. And if we do have any cloud boxes that are not like consolable in by blue teamers, what do we want those to look like? What services do we want to put on there? What kind of remote access do we want to allow to get into those cloud hosts? Those are a few very important questions. And to counter that, we also have the local area network, where users can directly console in and actually see the screen on the so-called device, even though it's just a VM. Balancing the number of local hosts versus cloud hosts is something that you're going to want to consider based on the competition. Do you want to give blue teamers easier access to the local hosts, or would you rather give easier access to a few maybe jump hosts that you can use to get into the cloud boxes? If you don't provide just generic jump hosts to get into the cloud boxes, the next question is what hosts on this topology and the local network can be used to access cloud hosts? Because if you have a weird OS on the LAN or something, that's probably not going to have a RDP bot, RDP like client on it. So you need to think about how these users are getting into the cloud host there. You should generally have at least one GUI box per team member just for this purpose. You want to make sure that if everyone needs to get into a cloud box simultaneously, they can.
Everyone should have on the LAN a box that they can sit at, and they don't need to SSH into it. Well, I should say, if you are there is a method of competition environment where you can have it so the teams access everything remotely, and their local area network is still something you remotely access. However, it's something you have direct access to, and you cannot access the cloud unless you're accessing from not your jump host, but the local area network. So that's an option. It's a risky one, because now you're basically saying, all right, blue team, be very careful with all of your firewall rules, because You usually can't lock yourself out of a LAN box with a firewall rule, but if you jump box into the LAN box, then you can. So that's a design choice you got to weigh in your mind.
Yep. Anything else?
There's been, last year we had like an isolated data center that wasn't, I don't think, quite directly. We had console into the data center at the physical location of the data center, which was a very interesting idea. We didn't do that this year, obviously, because can't be all in person. But that's another thing to keep in mind. You might want to have a separate area where somebody has to walk to interface with a console that could be accessed remotely in theory. And if you're really crazy, we've had a couple people thinking about this. Sort of like a mobile IoT, that's a possibility. You've got to be really careful about how that's networked, how that's scored, what sort of ways you're going to be doing checks on that, because it's going to require a significant amount of mental architecting.
All right. So, next question you're going to want to ask when you're trying to choose the types of devices you want in the topology is, what host OSs do you want? No. Actually, no, we've looked into it. Having Mac OS on competition infrastructure is really, really hard because it costs a lot of money. You'll do it for free. All right. Emmanuel, if you can get Mac OS X to run on Openstack, I would absolutely love to use it in a competition. But anyway, generally Mac OS isn't going to be something that we can use for a competition. But when you select a host OS, you want something that's going to be really useful given the scenario. So you don't want boxes that are just completely irrelevant to what you're trying to do. You also want them to be relevant. You want something new, something that they'll see in industry, because if they aren't seeing it in industry and they can't actually take something away from the competition they can use, then what is even the point? Newer host OSs are also much, much easier to get on OpenStack due to new technologies such as Cloud Init and auto installers, like we will mention later. You also want a few fun OSs, but not too many of these. These are kind of like the weird OSs that we talked about for the weird OS lead.
Right. And on the note of fun OSs, definitely keep in mind the audience of your competition. If it's a more advanced competition, you might throw in something a little wacky that you really have to, it's a curveball. You got to manage it somehow, completely out of left field. You got to learn a whole new firewall system or whatever. Or maybe even figure out how the networking stack even works, because it might not be standard. So you don't want to throw that at a beginner. Maybe a beginner level fun OS would be a flavor of Linux that has a different skin to it, or I don't know, has a different package manager. That might be a bit, but yeah.
One more thing on fun OSs is that generally, if it's too weird, Red Team might not target it near as much because none of their tooling works. So that's something to take into consideration as well. Do you actually want Red Team to be attacking this box? Because if you make it too weird, they're not going to be.
This is accurate. I don't think anybody spent much time on my Calibri OS boxes because there wasn't too much you could do.
They looked at it, but it was late enough that all
Right.
their FTP was blocked by that point.
Yeah, that makes sense. AKA turned off.
All right. So after you got the host OS you're running, next question is, what are you going to put on it? Again, you want to look at the competition theme for this. You want something that's actually going to be useful given the theme. So if you have, I don't know, a theoretical bank, you would try to look at a kind of like a banking application of some sort.
Right. And again, similar to the host OSs, you want to make sure they're relevant. You want the technologies to be relevant. So if for some reason, literally everyone in the entire world stopped using Apache 2, you probably wouldn't want to use Apache. That's not going to happen, obviously. But you wouldn't want to put necessarily Apache 2 into your environment because it's not a useful skill to take away. It is, so definitely put Apache in your environment and Nginx, and keep the technologies relevant. Make it usable, because you the services. If managing them kind of sucks, it's going to be more frustrating than it needs to be experienced for blue team. Blue teaming is always frustrating, I will say that, but it will be more frustrating than it needs to be. And like Josh said, thematic. Your org in your scenario has a theme. Go with it.
Yep. All right. For scoring, you're going to want to look at 3 different scoreboards. Scorestack, which is our personal favorite. We need to give a shout out to Sean Newman and Simon for that. They work very hard on Scorestack, and it works very, very well. We also have ScoreTrack, which is a UB kind of scoring engine. And finally, we have the OG scoring engine created by a Sparsolo.
I believe, yes.
You should definitely take a look at all 3 of these before choosing Scorestack. However, you should at least look at all 3 of these.
And
Anything
you
else?
should probably choose Scorestack. Scorestack is very nice. I will say UB did a great job with theirs as well. Having you interact with it, I was very impressed. So give them looks.
All right.
Deployment, what a fun time. Automation goes burr, and this is sort of the theme of all of this. You should be automating every single part of your deployment as much as possible. Why? Several reasons. 1, you can do it again really quickly if something needs to be redeployed. That's really important because you really don't want to have to, oh no, my Ansible didn't run correctly. Let me just rebuild this entire image by hand. I need to redeploy the whole topology by hand. Oh no, that's not going to work. That's going to make your entire development process really slow. So let's get into what we use to make that happen.
So first thing that you're going to need if you're going to be deploying on any virtualization environment is a base image. The base image is an installation of the OS in a VM readable form. So for the hypervisor you're using, that is configured in a specific way. And generally what you want is you want a management user, which is usually white team on our competitions, and you want SSH or WinRM to be enabled. The idea of this is that when we clone this image out to a bunch of different teams, you can actually just point Ansible at it, point a user and password, and hit go, and we can actually configure those images. Sometimes you need to do some specific stuff depending on the OS, so you may need to change a few settings first in the base image, but that's not usually how that works.
I will also note, on our infrastructure, in order to get the best performance out of our storage, we store our images, our base images, as raw images so that our copy on write can do a lot of work. So you're going to want all of your images to be in the raw format, which doesn't mean a lot to most people, but it's bigger.
Yeah, copy on write, if we have a raw image, allows us to store the base image in RAM. And then when we clone that out to, 15 teams, that image is already in RAM, and we can just write the changes to disk instead of writing the actual entirety of that image to disk. And since most of the base image is probably not going to change during the competition, you get a lot better performance that way.
Yes. All right, the Openstack. So what goes on Openstack? You're going to need management VMs from which you can manage all the team host VMs, which will also be on Openstack, the networks that all these go on, and then to access these things, you're going to need to create users for the teams. This is like a very high level overview. I'm going to give a sort of more in-depth one on the Terraform side.
The other thing to note here is that Openstack is our virtualization infrastructure. It's the tool that we use to actually deploy these VMs to our servers. And without Openstack, these competitions would not run. You can kind of think of OpenStack as kind of like an ESXi kind of thing, except it's free and it's a bit weirder. But we'll cover that later.
Weirder is accurate. I will say, most of this information applies to not just OpenStack. We happen to use OpenStack, so that's why this is here. If you end up in the cyber range, you might end up using a lot of VMware products. Your mileage may vary. All of this still applies in general to pretty much all of the virtualization cloud platforms that you could run this on. All right, Cloud Init, go ahead.
So Cloud Init is this new tech that is found on Debian-based images at the moment. And
Not
what
everything,
Cloud,
really.
well, it's getting there.
We're getting
But generally, right now, you're going to find it on Ubuntu-based images and Debian-based images by default, and then you can install it on some other OSs in Packer. And
will say
Packer will get to.
Red Hat images are getting better.
Yes.
They also have cloud images available
But
with Cloud Init.
when you're deploying to OpenStack, you generally want to make sure that the image somehow has Cloud Init working. And that usually involves installing it during the base image process. However, once you have Cloud Init enabled, what it essentially allows you to do is create one base VM, and then OpenStack can pass that base VM on deploy a configuration file. And that configuration file that's pulled from a HTTP server is going to essentially have a bunch of information for it on how to configure itself. So you can say, hey, look, this is the host name, this is the IP address, this is the number of packages I want you to install by default, and here's a bunch of users that you want to make. So it's very, very helpful, and it essentially means that we can generalize our images a bit. So we don't have to make competition-specific images anymore because we don't need competition-specific users to go on like the base configuration by default. We can just say, hey, look, we have this base VM or this cloud VM that you can download from certain Linux distros like Ubuntu server. We just have this generic Ubuntu cloud image, and once it boots up, it's going to automatically try to cloud in it. That information is pulled down, and the VM is configured how we need it to.
I'm realizing I should have put like a screenshot in the top right of like, this is what the cloud config looks like. They're not too hard to find. If you search cloudconfig.yaml, you'll probably find several good results. There's one documentation page by Red Hat which outlines basically everything that goes into it. And there's more documentation, but we don't have time to go all of that. But.
Yep. So the other way, I mentioned that you can just pull like a cloud image off of Ubuntu's site, but the other way to acquire a base image is something called Packer. Packer is a way of is an automated way of generating a base image, and it does this in a few ways. It essentially spins up a VM on the fly and configures it, and it can configure it via two ways. It can configure it with a boot command, which is how Linux has historically worked, or you can just attach like a Windows auto unattend file, and it can work that way too. So what's going on behind the scenes is Packer, when you run Packer build, the Packer is going to look at your configuration, it's going to pull down the base image, so that's going to be like the ISO file you're installing from. So you can pull down a Ubuntu ISO, for example, or a Windows ISO. Then it's going to attach media. So for Windows, it's going to attach what is essentially a flash drive with that auto unattend file on it. The Windows installer knows to look for that file, and if it sees it, configure the Windows installation appropriately. For Linux, some distros support a kind of USB drive approach like Windows, but what we have historically done is use something called the boot command. So Packer spins up the VM, waits a few seconds, and then just starts typing, which is incredibly jank, but it works. And that's going to either kick off one of the three different ways of auto-installing a Linux distro. Precede is the antiquated Debian way, where you just say, here's a list of every single question that can possibly be asked in installer. And yes, that is as awful as it sounds. However, up to this point, that's usually what we've had to work with, so we've had to make do. I should also note that auto-install is a new Ubuntu-based auto-installation method that has just been gaining some traction recently, but it's also based on Cloud Init. So you can pass along like certain Cloud Init stuff in addition to the auto-installation parameters. And that's much cleaner and much easier to use. The only downside to that approach is that you will have to delete a few files afterwards to make sure that Cloud Init can actually run again, since that counts as a Cloud Init run.
Yeah.
Finally, we've got Kickstart, and that's also a better way to do it than the Precede. And Kickstart is something you'll find on CentOS and Fedora-based distributions.
I will note one thing we didn't mention in the text of this slide, but we'll definitely tell you. All of these images need to be sysprep because they need to have unique identifiers for really everyone's sake in the competition environment,
Yes.
but especially for Red Team, because a lot of Red Team tooling uses like the host UUID as like an identifier, and if those are the same across things, not only does it break that, but it can also break things just in general. So sysprep so that it has a unique everything.
I'd also like to point out that a Packer should be considered a secondary option here. If you can find a cloud image and just cloud in it all your changes, you should probably do that. It's way easier. You don't have to deal with our Packer. Our Packer's generally decent, and it's already in GitLab. You probably just have to change it for this competition to break whatever bugs have happened since we last built it, which happens a lot because distros change, and the questions and the installers change in the case of the Precede. So you occasionally just, as a Linux lead or Windows lead, you're going to have to go through and change some stuff.
And one host that I use Alpine for my competition. It didn't have Cloud Init installed by default. They didn't have a cloud image ready because they literally just added it this patch. So you might literally just have a Packer build that builds an image and then installs Cloud Init, and then you're done. But getting to the Cloud Init stage still has to happen somehow.
Yep. So, never manually build an image. Don't do it.
It's a bad.
Very bad.
It's painful and really hard to reproduce. Now, there are times when it could be literally your only option. Usually this is when you're dealing with weird OSs that don't deal with automation very well. Robert probably had to deal with this a little bit. It's not fun. But you can.
I actually scripted my Collegiate OS in production.
Thank you.
Yes.
I didn't use Packer for it because you can't,
Yes.
instead of a bunch of complicated bastards that bounce things. But I did automate it because after like the second time I was like, no.
Exactly.
Robert just brought up that he had a bunch of random scripts to essentially build weird OSs for his time as Weird OS lead. Can you do that? Yes. Is it better than manually building images? Yes.
Absolutely.
Is it still jank? Yes.
I would rather have a bash script that mounts an image and changes a file system than having a person have to rebuild an image manually every time.
Yes.
This was the need that Mr. Robert set, and this is the finest example I can give. Even if your operating system that you're building an image for does not support Packer or a lot of these fancy automation things, find some way
Yeah.
to modify it to build the image, because it is not fun to have to wait for somebody to build an image by hand.
The last thing to note here is that you want to be able to pass on what you do to the next competition so that you can save time during development. And you can't do that if you manually build the image.
Correct.
So,
Terraform. I spent a ridiculous amount of time with Terraform. It's kind of frustrating sometimes, but when it works, boy is it beautiful. So what do we do with Terraform? Like I mentioned earlier on stuff we're doing with Openstack, we're deploying competition users, we're deploying, I didn't say this before, we're having the projects, we're deploying the networks, and we're deploying the hosts. So what does this mean? We have the users. We need to deploy the competition users. The teams need to be able to access the infrastructure. So using Terraform, we're going to automate the deployment of those users to the cloud. This means they can have access, and whenever we spin up the infrastructure, it's already there, ready to go. We don't have to go into the OpenStack console and like click through and type in passwords and get it wrong, and then teams complain that they don't have access and all of that. You can avoid all of that by running it through Terraform. You're going to also add their team groups so that you can control their access later on when you have the project. In a project, I don't know how much this exists in other like cloud providers, but in OpenStack, everything has a project, and then your roles and such are applied to the project, and the instances and all of that, they exist within the project. So you don't have access to the things unless you have access to the project. The reason this is important is because each team gets their own project so that we can control who has access to it. And we're going to give the teams read access to it so they can interact with only their VMs and only the ones we're letting them interact with, so like the LAN VMs. That's done through Terraform. Deploying the network, so you have like a LAN, and you have like a management network, and you have something that connects all of them, and have something that goes to where red team's coming from. All of that done through Terraform. Hosts, you're going to have to pick, you're going to specify your images, set the storage amounts, flavors, which is basically just like how much RAM, CPU you give it. You're going to put all the hosts on the networks that you made. You're going to assign all the like security group firewall rules to those hosts. And this is where the Cloud Init comes in. In Terraform, you can specify to the provider what cloud config you're going to pass in, or what initial config. It doesn't necessarily need to be a cloud config, it usually is, to the image so that it's passed in when it's created. All this, what this boils down to is you can press a few buttons and you have, boom, team 1, team 2, team 3. And you can do that very quickly with just a Terraform apply. The way I wrote the Terraform, you also specify a team number, but this is a very quick process. What does this mean? Okay, we have a test team. We really destroy it with our Ansible because it didn't work well. Delete it, redeploy it, rerun the Ansible, works now, great. This is very important for being able to spin up and spin down to different parts of the competition very quickly.
One last note about Terraform. I want you to think of this kind of like as a recipe for OpenStack. So you give when you run this Terraform, the Terraform goes and makes all the changes to OpenStack that basically sets up the competition from a virtualization standpoint and a team management standpoint. So teams get access to these privileges, these boxes, you know, so on and so forth. And that's probably the easiest way to think about it without going into a lot of details. Yeah.
if you are elected CA, please talk to me about the Terraform because I want you to be able to use it. It does so much work for you. I need to tweak a couple things about it right now, but it will save you so much time and it will get you your infrastructure spun up so much quicker if you know how to use it. So that's very useful. If the sooner the infrastructure is up for your black team to run Ansible against, the easier and the faster you can get done with the development of the competition. And maybe we'll finish it before the night before for once.
All right. So Ansible, we're actually pretty close to overtime here. Oh, we are overtime, so we should probably hurry up. But Ansible, I want you to think of as the Yayit of the competition deployment. So what's going on here? After you get your base images up, after you get each individual team deployed, Ansible is the thing that goes in and configures it. Technically, we could do all this in Cloud Init as well, but that would be awful, so we're not going to. Generally, you just want Cloud Init to do the base configuration. So you want it to say, hey, look, add these users. And then Ansible takes care of the rest. Ansible has modules for changing different parts of the system. And it makes it super, super convenient to just say, hey, yeah, use that Ansible module, install these packages, make these configuration changes, change this specific line in a file. That's the kind of stuff you can do with Ansible.
Avoid, Kyle's going to yell at us for saying that. Kyle will tell you, and it's probably best, try not to change single lines in files, but that's just a side note. Copy configs over templates. Templates, we love templates. You can make configurations based on teams. You can say pass in the team number. Use Ansible for all its power. Again, talk to the people who've done this before. If you have questions about Ansible, we'll probably get to talk later on Ansible. It is probably the most powerful tool we use from a deployment perspective. Everything else is to get us to the point where we can use Ansible. Finally, communication. So you've done all this work, you've got all this dev going on. Now, you need to get people into your competition. Otherwise, what's the point? You can just like run around, scramble, stay up late, and like get ready for a competition that nobody shows up to. So you got to get the word out, and you need to do that sooner rather than later. This is just a screenshot of all the emails that I have ignored. None of those are from ISTS because I got on those very quickly. You need to communicate well with the people. If they have questions, answer them quickly. Especially talk to sponsors sooner. We didn't get our word out soon enough this year for ISTS for sponsors, and I feel really bad about that. But they want to get involved earlier so they can know our sponsors especially have benefits that involve our competitions. And if they know the theme and they can submit if they can submit an inject, they can submit that sooner rather than later and have more dev time on it, that's ideal. So let people know early. They need to know when, they need to know where, they need to know how much it's going to cost them, especially for competitors, how much it's going to cost them to show up. You need to get their names so you know who's showing up and you can check them in when they come in. You need to let them know the team size. Usually we do 5 people. And then you also need to know their shirt sizes because competition shirts are really nice and we want to make sure everyone has their own shirts. So there you go.
All right.
We're really over, so there's
Yeah,
only
we
one
are
more
over.
slide for quick questions. Does anybody have questions in the room?
No?
Okay.
If you do it, one more thing. If you do have questions, even after us boomer CAs are graduated, just feel free to let us know anyway. We'll still be available.
Yeah, there's a secret network of former competition architects who will assist you.
Yes, that does exist.
And we also glossed over like so much, like this was thrown together over the course of like one day and we've skipped so much stuff because there's not enough time. So like, please, also don't let this scare you away because like as much as this is, if you have the right team around you, like it's manageable. You can do it. And we have successfully done it for many years in a row.
One more thing. You are not going to be doing all of this. Do not think for even a second that all of this is your job. Your job is to get a group of black teamers around you who can do this stuff while you do management. That is your job as a competition architect. We tell you all of the technical stuff so you know exactly how to pick your black teamers, but at the end of the day, you should not be working on the technical aspect as much as your black teamers.
Right. If we have done our job right and we've made our stuff somewhat reusable, the amount of work you should have to do is less and less every year. That's another thing. Please iterate on what we've done. We are trying so hard to make it so there's less work that goes in so you can actually focus on doing the cool things that we always talk about every year. Please, use what's already been there. Use what's already there. Talk to us if you need help using it. and apply for the positions. The election for my position, hopefully next week. Josh's election's about, what, a month?
Yeah.
Yeah. Talk to us about it. Let's get
Yeah.
get your applications in, and good luck. We'll be here for you.
All right.